When the decree came, it was not with thunder or fire but with words delivered in cold precision. The Council of Worlds, an ancient assembly of species who saw themselves as guardians of galactic order, had turned its gaze to Earth. Their judgment was swift and merciless. Humanity was reckless, dangerous, and unworthy of the privileges of interstellar society. The message was transmitted in 1,000 languages, carried by satellites that shimmered with alien seals of authority. Humanity, they declared, had crossed too many lines, wars too savage, machines too uncontrollable, a history too violent to ignore. The verdict was sanctions, comprehensive and absolute, meant to break the will of a young world before it could grow into a greater threat. The accusations struck with deliberate weight. Humanity's nuclear arsenals were cited as proof of instability, a species willing to scorch its own cradle in a fit of rage. The environmental scars carved into Earth were displayed as evidence of irresponsibility: oceans acidified, forests razed, skies darkened in pursuit of power. Even the wars of the past century were catalogued and replayed, every atrocity presented as if frozen in amber, undeniable proof that humans were ruled by aggression. The Council spoke not with malice but with condescension, as a teacher scolding a defiant child. To them, Earth was dangerous not because of what it had done, but because of what it might do if left unchecked. The sanctions were precise instruments of strangulation. Orbit was locked down by patrols of Council ships, their sleek forms cutting off the flow of commerce and starlight alike. Trade routes that had only just opened, promising a future of prosperity, were severed. Medical technologies, once exchanged freely, were withheld, leaving hospitals scrambling to replace treatments now forbidden. Manufacturing ground to a halt as access to rare materials and off-world energy sources vanished overnight. Earth's burgeoning economy, fragile yet ambitious, was reduced to rubble in weeks. The Council expected what they had seen before from other worlds: despair, fragmentation, and eventual capitulation. It was a formula they had refined across centuries: starve the ambitious until they kneel. But Earth did not kneel. The first reaction was confusion, a disbelieving outrage that burned across continents. People who had never agreed on anything before found common ground in fury. Crowds filled city squares from Lagos to Tokyo, from New Delhi to Buenos Aires, holding banners not of surrender but of defiance. Commentators on every broadcast argued not about whether the sanctions were unjust, they were, but about how to answer. Politicians who had once spent their careers guarding borders suddenly spoke of a common humanity, of a species targeted not as nations but as one. For the first time, humanity was united not by fear of one another, but by anger directed outward. The Council watched with detached interest as weeks turned to months, expecting the fires of unity to collapse into ashes. But instead of crumbling, Earth adapted. Where trade faltered, ingenuity filled the gaps. Engineers stripped down old machines, repurposed civilian satellites, and began sketching designs no one dared dream before. Scientists who had once competed across borders began pooling data, publishing breakthroughs faster than the embargoes could suppress. Even the common people, bruised by scarcity, displayed a stubborn resilience, rationing supplies and volunteering for projects aimed not at survival but at defiance. The message grew louder with each passing day: humanity would not be broken by decree. It was in these months that a dangerous thought began to take root. Sanctions were supposed to tame humanity, to force it into compliance. Instead, they planted a seed of resolve that no fleet or blockade could suppress. The question shifted from how to endure to how to fight back. The idea was not whispered in secret corners but spoken aloud by leaders and echoed by ordinary citizens. If the Council wished to smother Earth, then Earth would teach them the price of trying. Anger hardened into purpose, and purpose began to crystallize into plans. The Council had expected hunger, despair, and riots. What they had not anticipated was the stubborn will of a species that had clawed its way through ice ages, plagues, and wars, always finding a way to survive. Humanity, for all its flaws, had never been allowed to forget struggle. Where older species had been cradled by millennia of stability, Earth had forged its people in fire and famine. Now, under the weight of sanctions, those same instincts awoke again. The people of Earth looked up at the Council's ships hanging in orbit and saw not masters, but enemies. They began to speak not of submission, but of resistance. And in the silence of that realization, a vow formed that stretched across the entire species. If the stars wanted war, then war is what they would get. The sanctions bit deep, and the first months were a trial by fire. Supply chains collapsed, medicines dwindled, and shelves emptied. At first there was fear, then unrest, but instead of dissolving into chaos, something unprecedented happened. Rivals who had drawn lines in blood now found themselves staring at the same enemy. Leaders who once sparred over ideology or trade began speaking the same language. From power blocks that had stood opposed for centuries came an accord, drafted in urgency, and sealed with a shared oath: humanity would no longer divide itself. What was once United Nations in name alone became the Earth Defense Accord in truth, a binding pact of survival and defiance. The transformation was not gentle. Arguments flared, pride clashed, but necessity ruled over history. Generals accustomed to secrecy opened their vaults to foreign analysts. Scientists who had once concealed research for patents now posted findings to a unified network. Borders still existed, but in space, only one flag remained: the human flag. For the first time in recorded history, the Earth acted as a single entity, bound together by a threat too great for divisions to endure. What the Council intended as suffocation instead forged unbreakable cohesion. This unity birthed innovation at a speed that stunned even the Council's observers. Old mining rigs, once scraping asteroids for ore, were retrofitted with armor plating and rail cannons. Communication satellites became command relays for orbital militias. Factories repurposed their lines to churn out drones, missiles, and experimental shielding. The brilliance of humanity was not in polished perfection but in ruthless adaptation. Where the Council relied on millennia of refinement, Earth relied on urgency and the willingness to gamble. A weapon cobbled together from spare parts might fail spectacularly, or it might pierce the hull of a Council ship. Either way, it was worth the risk. Technology was not the only battlefield. Humanity struck with invisible hands in the networks beyond Earth. Hackers and coders became soldiers, slipping through galactic communication webs and leaving chaos in their wake. Council archives reported phantom fleets, falsified orders, and entire colonies plunged into silence for days as human code tangled systems never designed for such aggression. These attacks carried no banners, no signatures, but the message was clear: Earth was not isolated, and it would not play by rules written by alien empires. Even as weapons and tactics multiplied, the deeper transformation occurred in spirit. The Council expected to see despair, but what emerged was resolve. Scarcity was endured, not lamented. Blackouts became symbols of shared sacrifice. Families rationed with pride, knowing their small burdens fed the greater struggle. Propaganda spread, not manufactured lies but genuine conviction. Humanity was fighting not only for survival but for dignity. Slogans emerged, painted on walls, chanted in rallies, whispered across airwaves: we bend for no one. We break for no one. The blockade, designed to weaken, became the very crucible of will. And from this crucible came the planning of a first strike. It was not a matter of if but when. Generals spoke of fighting a war humanity could not conventionally win, but they did not speak of surrender. The goal was not conquest but demonstration, to bleed the Council until it understood that Earth could never be subdued. Every discussion ended with the same refrain: if humanity was to fall, it would fall fighting in a way that could never be ignored. What the Council underestimated was not human weapons, but human intent. They saw primitives clinging to survival. What they would soon face was a predator willing to take any wound so long as it could strike back. The Council believed they were watching a world in decline. In reality, they were watching a species unify in defiance, something rare even in the annals of galactic history. While embargoes tightened and fleets patrolled Earth's skies, the people below sharpened their teeth. The young trained in programs that once prepared astronauts, now meant for soldiers. The old passed down every lesson of hardship and endurance. What once was competition for dominance among nations became collaboration for survival of the species. Humanity was becoming something new, something the Council had not predicted, an adversary bound not by conquest or empire, but by necessity and pride. Outwardly, Earth still seemed small, still fragile under the watchful eyes of its would-be masters. But beneath that fragile shell, a storm was gathering. In every lab, every factory, every war room, humans worked with a singular purpose. They were not dreaming of surrender. They were preparing to show the galaxy what it meant to corner a species that had never once gone quietly into extinction. What began as punishment was transforming into a declaration. Earth would not kneel. And soon, Earth would strike. The day came when silence ended and the first shot was fired in defiance. A Council patrol entered the outer edge of the system expecting only token resistance, perhaps a handful of crude vessels to be brushed aside. Instead, they encountered an ambush that bore no resemblance to the predictable skirmishes the Council had faced in the past. Human ships, patched together from mining rigs and industrial hulls, emerged from shadowed orbits and hurled weapons with startling ferocity. They did not maneuver like trained fleets, but with chaotic precision, each vessel piloted by crews willing to improvise, to gamble, to sacrifice. What should have been a routine suppression became the Council's first rude awakening. Their ships were not merely attacked, they were destroyed. The victory was small in scale but enormous in meaning. Humanity's tactics were not refined by centuries of tradition but sharpened by desperation and creativity. Where other species sought symmetry and order, humans embraced unpredictability. They used the terrain of the system as their weapon, asteroids mined hollow to hide explosives, gravity wells bent into slingshots for missiles, radiation storms used to cloak advances. They fought with tools the Council dismissed as primitive, nuclear warheads, kinetic rods, and drones that seemed little more than toys. Yet when unleashed with precision and sheer recklessness, these tools proved devastating. Council commanders began reporting engagements unlike any they had ever studied. Battles that should have lasted minutes stretched into days, and every victory against humans was paid for in blood and fire. The genius of humanity's approach lay in the willingness to exploit weaknesses the Council didn't even recognize. Their networks, vast and sophisticated, were riddled with doors no one had ever dared test. Human code slithered through these systems, turning defenses into traps and sowing confusion at the worst possible moments. Entire flotillas received falsified orders, colliding with one another in the chaos of scrambled communications. Beacons lit up where no ships were, phantoms haunting the Council's scanners until commanders began to question their instruments. The Council realized, too late, that humans did not need to outbuild or outgun them, they only needed to outthink them. Each confrontation deepened the psychological toll. Humanity's defiance was not hidden but broadcast deliberately. Alien audiences witnessed intercepted transmissions of human voices mocking their overlords, taunting them with promises of more destruction. Symbols of resistance were etched into the void itself, flags anchored to shattered Council hulls, messages burned into asteroid surfaces. It was not enough to fight. Humanity demanded to be seen fighting. The Council's aura of inevitability, once unshakable, began to erode. For the first time in centuries, the Galactic Order faced an enemy that treated survival as secondary to defiance. Then came the clash that altered the war's balance. A massive Council fleet assembled, determined to shatter Earth's defiance in one overwhelming blow. Dozens of warships, bristling with weapons far beyond anything humanity could match, descended upon the solar system with confidence bordering on arrogance. Yet the humans were ready. They had studied every patrol, every engagement, and they knew they could not meet strength with strength. Instead, they transformed Jupiter's orbit into a battlefield of traps. Stations hidden within its magnetosphere unleashed volleys timed to coincide with gravity-assisted strikes. Nuclear mines detonated with brutal precision, crippling the vanguard. Human fleets struck not head-on but from angles no sane commander would risk, turning debris fields into weapons and retreat paths into kill zones. The Council fleet did not collapse, but it bled. Ship after ship was lost, not to superior firepower, but to the relentless cunning of an enemy that refused to follow the expected script. For every human vessel destroyed, another appeared where it should not have been, striking in ways no war manual accounted for. When the battle ended, the Council retained its presence, but its pride was shattered. Humanity had not only survived but inflicted losses so severe they could not be dismissed as luck. The message was undeniable: Earth was no longer a victim but a combatant, and its people had proven they could stand against the galaxy's finest. The war that was supposed to be swift had transformed into something the Council had dreaded yet never admitted: a campaign of attrition against a species too stubborn to quit. Humanity did not need victory in the traditional sense. Every ship destroyed, every patrol harassed, every system infiltrated carried the same truth: Earth would not be broken. To defeat this species, the Council would have to burn it to ashes, and even then, there was no guarantee the embers would not rise again. What had begun as a punitive measure was now an open conflict, and the Council found itself locked in a struggle against an enemy unlike any it had ever faced, one that fought with the fury of desperation and the creativity of survival, and one that was only growing stronger with every battle survived. The victories came at a price no one could ignore. The Council, humiliated by setbacks, answered with fury. Their fleets turned their weapons not only on human warships but on the world that had defied them. Cities were reduced to burning scars, whole populations buried under fire from orbit. The death toll rose into millions within days, and for the first time since the conflict began, Earth trembled. Yet even in mourning, humanity did not yield. The sight of devastation hardened resolve instead of softening it. The Council thought terror would shatter resistance, but grief became the fuel of vengeance. Families who lost everything gave what little remained to the war effort, demanding only that their sacrifices be honored through continued defiance. Every attack deepened the bond among survivors. No longer was this a war fought by generals and soldiers alone. It was waged by the entirety of humanity. Farmers donated harvests to sustain troops. Engineers left comfortable jobs to design new weapons in underground workshops. Children carried messages across ruined streets, while the elderly lent their wisdom to strategies that required patience and endurance. The Council's assault did not weaken humanity. It transformed every individual into a participant in the struggle. Earth itself became an army, united not just by command but by shared purpose. Even as devastation mounted, whispers began to circulate from beyond the solar system. Other species, long subdued by the Council's authority, watched in silence as humanity endured. They saw a young race refuse to bend in the face of power that had crushed countless civilizations before. Small gestures began to appear: encrypted transmissions carrying fragments of intelligence, anonymous deliveries of materials too advanced for Earth to replicate. Some alien captains deserted their posts to fight alongside humans, declaring that if any species could stand against tyranny, it was this one. What had started as isolation slowly grew into something larger. Humanity was no longer alone. Their war was inspiring others to resist. The Council, realizing its campaign was faltering, escalated once more. Massive fleets returned, supported by technologies that Earth could not hope to match. Yet this time, they faced an opponent armed with new weapons born of necessity. Orbital railguns, constructed from Earth's heaviest industries, hurled projectiles with such force that even Council flagships found their shields buckling. These colossal weapons were crude but terrifyingly effective, symbols of humanity's refusal to fight on anyone else's terms. The very charge once leveled against them, that they were dangerous, became their strength. Humanity leaned into its reputation, embracing ingenuity that bordered on recklessness. Losses remained staggering. Entire regions were blackened, and resources stretched thinner with every passing month. Yet the Council found no surrender in its enemy. They discovered instead a capacity for endurance that exceeded prediction. Humans absorbed pain and continued forward. Every bombardment became a rallying cry. Every city destroyed was rebuilt with what remained. Every death was not an ending but a declaration that the survivors would not quit. To the Council, this stubbornness appeared irrational. To humanity, it was the only path left. The war had transformed humanity into something unfamiliar even to itself. The divisions of old remained in memory, but in practice they were gone. People no longer asked what flag someone served, they asked only what contribution they could make. The shared identity of species outweighed every prior allegiance. It was not a government or a nation fighting, it was humanity as a whole. That unity was not built on prosperity or luxury but forged in the crucible of suffering. The Council had intended to crush a single world. Instead, they had summoned a force that no empire could easily extinguish. As months turned into years, the conflict reached a grim equilibrium. Humanity lacked the numbers and technology to expand, but the Council found itself unable to break them. The war became a test of will, one side seeking domination, the other seeking only to endure. In this contest, every sacrifice mattered, every act of defiance rippled outward. The Council had power, but Earth had conviction. And conviction proved to be a weapon no blockade, no bombardment, no sanction could neutralize. The cost was staggering, and the wounds would scar generations. Yet those who lived through it understood something profound. Survival under such odds was itself a form of victory. Humanity had paid with blood and fire, but what remained was unbroken. The Council had unleashed destruction, but in doing so they had created something far more dangerous than they ever anticipated, a species united by suffering, unwilling to bow, and determined to fight until the galaxy itself recognized their place. The war reached its breaking point when both sides realized neither could destroy the other without sacrificing everything. Humanity, though battered, remained standing, and the Council, though vast, had suffered wounds it could not easily conceal. Their fleets, once symbols of inevitability, limped back from battles with losses that stung the pride of empires. What should have been a swift lesson had become a drawn-out struggle, and the galaxy was watching. Each clash, each stalemate, eroded the Council's aura of supremacy, and whispers spread that perhaps this young species had done the impossible. They had forced the rulers of the stars to hesitate. In orbit, ships hovered scarred but functional, monuments to the resilience of their crews. On Earth, ruins were rebuilt not out of luxury but out of necessity, each reconstruction an act of defiance. The Council sent emissaries demanding submission, but the messages went unanswered or returned with silence. Humanity had no interest in kneeling, only in enduring until endurance itself compelled respect. And at last, even the Council's own strategists admitted the truth. Breaking Earth entirely would require a war so total it might destabilize the very order they were sworn to preserve. What was meant to discipline had become a danger to their own dominion. So the terms shifted. Negotiations were initiated not from a position of mercy, but from reluctant recognition. Humanity had bled enough to be acknowledged, and the Council, though unwilling to admit defeat, conceded ground. The blockade was lifted. Sanctions were relaxed. Earth was recognized as a sovereign participant in interstellar affairs, no longer a rogue child but a peer that had proven itself in the harshest trial. The treaty that followed was written in cautious words, but behind every phrase lingered the unspoken fact: this outcome was earned not by pleading but by war. For humanity, the moment was not triumph but vindication. The scars of conflict were too fresh, the graves too numerous for celebration. Yet the knowledge that the galaxy now looked at Earth differently carried weight. No longer could humans be dismissed as reckless upstarts. They had forced empires to reckon with them, not by seeking approval but by enduring punishment until recognition became unavoidable. In the ashes of their cities and the silence of their dead, a legacy had been carved that could not be erased. The message spread far beyond the Council's chambers. Across distant systems, species that had lived for centuries under silent obedience now stirred. They had watched a young, fragile world refuse to break under the heel of power. The example was undeniable. Defiance was possible, resistance could endure, and even the mightiest fleets could bleed. Rebellions began in whispers, colonies questioned their governors, and the fabric of authority stretched thinner than before. Humanity had not sought to become a symbol, but the galaxy had chosen them as one. Their struggle ignited sparks they had not intended, and those sparks began to spread. Back on Earth, life resumed in altered form. The war had reshaped identity, leaving a species far more unified than before. Borders remained on maps, but in practice, the sense of a singular humanity dominated. Industries rebuilt with cooperation rather than rivalry, research flowed across continents, and defense became a shared responsibility. The old divisions had not vanished, but they had been eclipsed by a memory. When survival was at stake, humanity had stood together. That memory became both shield and weapon, a reminder to future generations of what had been endured and why. In speeches and writings, leaders framed the conflict not as a tale of conquest but as a lesson. The galaxy did not fear humanity because of what they had destroyed, but because of what they had endured. They had proven that strength was not measured only in weapons or fleets, but in the refusal to surrender even when crushed by overwhelming force. That truth resonated more deeply than any treaty. It was a declaration written in struggle. Humanity was dangerous not because it sought war, but because it could never be forced to kneel. As decades passed, the story solidified into legend. Children grew up hearing how their species had been judged and punished, yet refused to bow. Memorials stood in every city, honoring those who had given their lives so the rest might stand free. The Council, wary yet watchful, never forgot the lesson it had learned. Sanctions could starve a world, fleets could burn cities, but neither could extinguish the will of humanity. That will had become their greatest weapon, one no power could replicate or predict. And so the legacy was sealed. Humanity did not claim to be the oldest, nor the wisest, nor the strongest among the stars. But they carried a truth few others possessed, that when pushed to the edge of extinction, they would rise with teeth bared, and in that rising they would command respect. The Council had sought to humble Earth, but in the attempt they had created something far more enduring, a people who had proven to themselves, and to the galaxy, that they would fight until the very end. Not for conquest, not for dominion, but for the unshakable right to stand unbroken.